I'm Ryan.
And I'm Tessa.
This is The Dark Dive, where we examine the stories that refuse to stay buried.
Every episode, we follow the evidence, confront the unknown, and bring clarity to the shadows.
No speculation, no sensationalism, just the truth, wherever it leads.
You're listening to The Dark Dive.
You send your kids to school with a basic assumption.
Right, it's an unwritten contract.
Exactly, Tessa. You believe that the building they walk into at, 8 in the morning is a sanctuary of routine. I mean, math classes, lunch bells.
Hallways filled with that predictable noise.
Yeah. You expect them to come home. You do not expect them to vanish between the cinder block walls of a campus they know by heart.
No, you don't.
And you certainly do not expect that the next time you see them, it will be under circumstances so physically baffling, so entirely stripped of logic, that it just tears an entire community apart.
On January 10th, 2013, a 17-year-old student named Kendrick Johnson walked into Lowndes High School in Valdosta, Georgia. And, he was a son, he was a brother.
A young man with his whole life ahead of him.
Right, his entire life stretching out in front of him. He went to his classes. He navigated the hallways just like hundreds of other students that day. And then, well, he simply never came home.
The next morning, his body was discovered.
Yeah.
He was found inside the school's old gymnasium.
Yeah.
But Tessa, it was the exact manner of his discovery that immediately fractures reality.
It really does.
He was found deceased, lodged deep inside a rolled-up, upright wrestling mat.
The conflict at the center of this case is absolute, Ryan. I mean, on one side, you have the official conclusion. Both local and federal authorities ultimately closed this case.
They did.
They ruled Kendrick's death a tragic freak accident. But on the other side,
You have the physical anomalies.
exactly. You have crime scene details that resist simple explanations. You have these severe forensic discrepancies that emerge long after the scene was cleared.
Right.
And you have a grieving family who looked at the facts, looked at the undeniable impossibilities of the evidence, and insisted that the official narrative is fundamentally broken.
A teenager goes to school. He is found dead inside a rolled-up piece of athletic equipment. The authorities call it an accident. The family calls it a cover-up.
It's a massive divide.
It is. Tessa, to understand how a community completely lost faith in the institutions meant to protect them, we can't just look at the aftermath.
No, you have to look at the timeline.
Right, we have to trace the exact moments where the normal became the unthinkable.
We do, Ryan, because investigations are built on establishing a baseline. You have to know what a normal Thursday looked like before you can understand how everything went wrong.
So let's look at that baseline. Who was Kendrick Johnson?
Well, he was known to his friends and family as KJ. He was 17 years old. And by all accounts from his coaches and teachers, he was quiet. He was heavily athletic.
He played multiple sports, right?
Yeah, football and basketball mostly. And he was deeply focused on his future. I mean, he wasn't a kid known for getting into trouble or instigating fights.
He was well-liked by his classmates.
He was. He was exactly who you hope your teenager is growing up to be.
He was grounded. He had focus.
Exactly, Ryan. And on the morning of January 10th, that focus was completely normal. There is no evidence in any of the initial police reports suggesting distress.
No arguments in the cafeteria, nothing like that.
Nothing. No documented conflict, no strange behavior leading up to that afternoon. He just went to his classes. He moved through his routine.
And the digital footprint confirms this.
It does. Lowndes High School had a sprawling surveillance system. I mean, we are talking about multiple cameras covering the hallways, the cafeterias, the entrances to the gyms.
Right.
After his last class, the cameras captured Kendrick. The footage shows him walking down a hallway, heading in the direction of the old gym.
That is his final confirmed movement. Just a few frames of video.
It is. He walks toward the gym, and then the timeline simply stops. He doesn't return home that evening. His family, immediately sensing that something is terribly wrong, reports him missing early the next morning.
Because they know his habits.
Right. They know he does not just disappear.
So we have this digital breadcrumb trail that just vanishes. There is an agonizing overnight gap between that last camera frame and what happens the next morning. Tessa, walk me through the exact layout of that old gym when the students arrived on January 11th.
Okay, so the old gym at the high school was a large, echoey space used in part for storage. Along the perimeter of the gym, these large, heavy wrestling mats were stored vertically.
Stood up on end.
Yeah, they were rolled up tightly into large cylinders and stood on end, leaning slightly against the walls or, each other. On that morning, a group of students were in the gym filling out surveys.
Just a normal school day activity.
Right. And some of them noticed something unusual about one of the mats. It wasn't until they looked closer, peering down into the top of the rolled-up cylinder, that they made a horrific discovery.
Kendrick.
Yes. Investigators arrived and documented the scene. Kendrick's body was inside one of the upright rolled wrestling mats. He was positioned upside down.
Upside down.
Yeah. He was wedged vertically deep into the narrow center opening of the rolled foam.
Let's stop and examine the exact physics of this space, because this is where the logic hits a wall for me, Tessa.
I know what you mean.
A standard school wrestling mat is not a yoga mat. It is massive. It is made of dense, heavy-duty foam designed to absorb the impact of two athletes throwing each other to the floor.
Right. It weighs hundreds of pounds.
Hundreds of pounds. When you roll it up and stand it on end, it is roughly 6 feet tall. And the opening in the center is incredibly narrow, sometimes only 14 inches across.
It is a highly confined, completely unyielding space.
Right. So I have to ask a mechanical question.
Okay.
How does a 17-year-old high school athlete, a young man with broad shoulders, become wedged vertically, completely upside down inside a 14-inch opening without knocking the mat over?
It's the central question of the whole case.
If you dive or reach into a freestanding cylinder of foam that is 6 feet tall, the displacement of your body weight should logically shift the center of gravity.
The mat should tip.
It should fall over. Or at the very least, it should cause a massive, visible disturbance to the other mats stored right next to it.
Yeah.
How does someone end up trapped like that while the mat remains perfectly upright?
That is the exact question that haunted everyone looking at this case, Ryan. The physics of the scene feel completely counterintuitive to human movement.
Completely.
But let me break down the official explanation clearly, because we really have to understand what the initial investigators believed happened. They surveyed the scene, they looked at the positioning, and they formulated a theory.
Okay.
They ruled the cause of death as accidental positional asphyxia.
Positional asphyxia. Explain the biology of that.
Positional asphyxia happens when a person's body is trapped in a position that basically prevents them from breathing adequately. When you are stuck upside down in a narrow, compressive space, your body works against itself.
Gravity and pressure.
Exactly, Ryan. The heavy foam restricts the diaphragm from expanding. Gravity forces blood to rush to the head and the lungs. With every breath you exhale, your body sinks slightly deeper into the wedge, making the next breath even harder to draw in.
Because there's nowhere else to go but down.
Yes. The chest cannot expand, and eventually the body simply runs out of oxygen. It is a terrifying, rapid, and silent process.
It is a horrific way to die. But how did the investigators conclude he got in there in the first place? A slip? A fall?
Well, the official narrative, the theory built by local authorities, was that Kendrick had stored a pair of gym shoes inside the rolled-up mat.
Inside the mat?
Yeah. According to some student interviews, this was a somewhat common practice to avoid paying for a locker. You drop your shoes into the center of the mat, and you grab them the next day.
Okay.
The theory is that Kendrick climbed up onto the surrounding mats, reached down into the center of the vertical cylinder to retrieve a shoe, lost his balance, slipped headfirst into the narrow opening, and became hopelessly trapped.
Slipped head first.
Right. And because of the tight foam, his arms would have been pinned to his sides or above his head, leaving him absolutely no leverage to push himself back out.
A reach. A loss of balance. A fatal accident.
That is what the local authorities concluded. An unspeakable tragedy, but an accident nonetheless.
A theory is only as good as the physical evidence that supports it, Tessa. You build a conclusion on the foundation of the crime scene.
You do.
But the evidence here is fractured. It contradicts itself. The physical anomalies are too glaring to ignore. Tessa, I think it's time we take this into the dark dive.
I agree, Ryan, because when you look past the initial summary and examine the actual forensic data, the foundation of that accidental ruling begins to completely fall apart.
The Johnson family refused to accept the official ruling.
They did. They knew their son.
They looked at the dimensions of his shoulders, they looked at the dimensions of that mat, they read the initial police reports, and they completely rejected the conclusion.
And they did what any desperate grieving family would do when the system fails to provide answers that make logical sense. They fought back.
They demanded a second look.
Yes. They hired their own independent forensic pathologist to conduct a second autopsy. And Ryan, the findings of that second autopsy are where this case shifts from a tragic mystery into something deeply, profoundly disturbing.
Let's talk about those anomalies.
When the independent pathologist examined Kendrick's exhumed body, They made a shocking discovery. Kendrick's internal organs, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the liver, were entirely missing.
Wait, stop right there, Tessa.
I know.
Are you telling me the medical examiner or whoever handled his body simply lost his vital organs?
They were completely gone, Ryan. But the horror of that discovery is compounded by what the second pathologist found in their place.
What was it?
The empty body cavity had been stuffed with old newspaper.
Newspaper. In a modern death investigation, I need you to explain this to me, Tessa, because as a listener, you hear that and your mind immediately recoils.
It does.
It sounds like something out of a Victorian horror story. How is that even physically or legally possible?
It represents a catastrophic breakdown of protocol, Ryan. Let me break down how a standard autopsy works so you can see just how massive a violation this is.
Okay.
In a standard forensic examination, the medical examiner removes the internal organs. They do this to weigh them, examine them for hidden trauma, and take microscopic tissue samples.
That's standard procedure.
Right. Once that process is complete, standard procedure dictates that the organs are placed in a fluid-tight biohazard bag. That bag is then placed back inside the body cavity before the body is sutured and released to the funeral home.
Okay.
Now, sometimes, if organs are too degraded or compromised, a funeral home might use respectfully designed medical-grade filler to maintain the body's shape for a viewing.
Medical-grade filler, not trash.
Never trash, never discarded newspaper from a grocery store. It is a profound indignity to the victim.
It's horrific.
But beyond the emotional devastation for the family, it has severe, irreversible investigative implications.
It destroys the chain of custody.
It annihilates it. Without those organs, the second pathologist could not independently verify the exact mechanisms of death.
Because the organs tell the story.
Exactly. The lungs and the brain are the primary pieces of evidence in an asphyxiation case. You need to examine the blood vessels in the eyes and the lungs for petechial hemorrhaging to confirm lack of oxygen.
And that evidence was just gone.
Gone. You cannot double-check the work of the first medical examiner if the primary biological data has vanished into thin air.
And it immediately raises the question of who was responsible.
Of course. The state medical examiner claimed the organs were placed back in the body before it was sent to the funeral home.
And the funeral home.
The funeral home claimed the body arrived empty, and they used the newspaper as a standard practice for volume replacement.
That creates a massive shadow of doubt over every single person who handled the evidence.
It really does. But the second autopsy didn't just find missing organs, did it?
No, it didn't. The second pathologist documented physical trauma that the first autopsy either entirely dismissed or interpreted completely differently.
Specifically, the independent report noted unexplained deep tissue bruising on Kendrick's jaw and the right side of his neck.
The neck and the jaw,
So-
areas that are incredibly vulnerable in a physical altercation.
Exactly, Ryan. And the family argued, with the backing of this second medical report, that this kind of blunt force trauma is completely inconsistent with a simple slip and fall into a wrestling mat.
Because of the material.
Yes. Wrestling mats are designed to yield. They are meant to cushion impact.
Right.
Slipping against smooth, yielding foam does not typically cause localized deep tissue hemorrhaging to the jawline. That specific kind of injury points heavily toward a potential physical altercation.
It points to a strike or pressure applied by a hard object or a hand before he ever entered the mat.
Yes. And then there is the blood evidence. If we step back from the autopsy files and look at the scene itself, the geometry of the evidence presents a puzzle that the official narrative completely fails to solve.
Let's look at the shoes.
Okay, so remember, the official theory, the entire basis for the accident ruling, is that Kendrick reached into the mat to retrieve a pair of gym shoes.
Right.
Investigators did find a pair of shoes near his body. They also noted a significant pool of blood discovered beneath them on the gym floor.
Which is biologically expected in this scenario.
It is. In cases of positional asphyxia, where a person is trapped upside down, gravity takes over. Blood pools in the lowest points of the body, a process called livor mortis.
Right.
Eventually, the pressure causes the blood and fluid to purge from the nose and mouth.
So you have a heavy flow of blood moving straight down by gravity.
Yes. But here is the severe physical contradiction. The shoes found near his body, the very shoes he was supposedly trying to reach, or the ones that had somehow dislodged during his fall, had absolutely no blood transfer on them.
They were pristine.
They were pristine.
Explain the impossibility of that.
If he was bleeding heavily enough to form a substantial pool at the base of the mat, and those shoes were in the immediate confined vicinity of that 14-inch space, the total absence of blood spatter, drops, or transfer on the footwear defies the basic mechanics of fluid dynamics.
Because gravity pulls it straight down.
Exactly. If blood falls through a narrow tube, anything at the bottom of that tube gets hit.
It suggests the scene was static, or that the items were placed there after the fact. It doesn't look like a chaotic accident.
It looks staged. That is what the family and their investigators argued.
Right.
And then there is the blood on the wall. According to the crime scene reports, investigators found a smear of blood on a wall nearby in the old gym.
A blood smear on the wall.
Yes. It was swabbed. It was sent to a lab and tested. The results came back. The blood on the wall was not Kendrick's.
Let that sink in. We have an unexplained, violent biological marker blood that belongs to an unidentified person, just sitting on the wall in the exact same room where a 17-year-old is found dead under completely impossible circumstances.
And the official local investigation essentially brushed it aside.
Oh.
They treated it as unrelated background noise. They argued that in a busy high school, kids get bloody noses, they scrape their knees, and blood gets on walls.
But you cannot simply ignore unidentifiable blood at a death scene just because it doesn't fit your predetermined theory.
You really can't.
When you're building a case for a freak accident, you have to account for all the variables in the room.
Which brings us back to the digital footprint, the cameras.
Right.
Because if the physical evidence is fractured, the surveillance footage is practically shattered. We established that the school had an extensive multi-camera surveillance system.
Yes, we did.
We know Kendrick was caught on camera walking toward the gym, but what exactly happens to the footage from that point forward?
It falls into a black hole.
Exactly.
The surveillance logs detail massive, highly problematic gaps in the digital record. During the critical window of time when Kendrick would have entered the gym and supposedly suffered this fatal accident, the camera system effectively fails.
It doesn't just fail in one way, Ryan. It fails in multiple compounding ways.
Break that down.
First, investigators found that some cameras pointing toward the gym area were completely out of focus, rendering the images useless.
Out of focus.
Second, several cameras were inexplicably pointed away from key areas. Instead of documenting the entrances and interiors they were installed to monitor, they were recording blank walls or empty corridors.
Blank walls.
And third, and perhaps most damning of all, there were literal time gaps in the digital footage.
Portions of the recording during that critical afternoon simply do not exist.
Right. The time codes jump.
Tessa, a security camera is essentially a mechanical guard. You install them to watch the doors, and the school's system operated like a guard who only blinks when you need them to stare.
That's a very accurate way to look at it.
It is the exact moment, the exact 15-minute window where you require visual confirmation of an accident, and the tape goes completely dark.
That is exactly how the community felt, Ryan. It felt intentional.
Because a single camera being out of focus could just be poor maintenance. A camera pointed the wrong way. Could be a careless custodian bumping it with a ladder. A time gap could be a random digital glitch on a hard drive.
Right.
But all of those things happening simultaneously in the same localized network, exactly in the window of a teenager's unexplained death. The statistical probability of that being a mere coincidence is vanishingly small. What did the forensic analysis of those DVR systems show?
Well, the analysis of the DVR hard drives was highly contested. The school officials maintained that the system was motion activated.
Motion activated.
They argued that the gaps in time were simply moments when no one was moving in the frame, so the camera stopped recording to save hard drive space.
But if a teenager is walking into a gym, climbing on mats and falling into one, that is motion.
Exactly. It should have triggered the sensors. As an analyst, I have to look at the raw possibilities. I know that schools are notorious for having outdated, poorly maintained technology. Systems glitch. Motion sensors fail to trigger. A gap in footage doesn't inherently prove a malicious cover-up.
But context is everything, Tessa. You don't look at evidence in a vacuum.
No, you don't. And that is the crux of the issue.
Right.
If the only anomaly in this entire case was a skipped camera frame, you might accept the glitch theory. You might accept the motion sensor excuse.
Sure.
But we are not looking at an isolated tech failure. We are looking at missing video footage combined with unidentified blood on the gym wall. We are looking at pristine, unbloodied shoes sitting directly beneath a pool of purged blood.
It builds on itself.
It does. We are looking at blunt force bruising to the neck and jaw. And we are looking at a teenager whose vital organs were removed from his body and replaced with newspaper.
When you stack those facts together, the narrative collapses.
It completely destroys the foundation of trust. The local authorities lost control of this narrative because the evidence they presented was too fractured, too illogical to support their conclusion of a simple accident.
The discrepancies were too loud.
Yes.
The local police couldn't contain the public outcry.
Yeah.
The physical impossibilities demanded a higher authority. The family demanded someone step in who wasn't tied to the local jurisdiction.
They did. And that brings us to the next massive phase of this story. Because the local ruling wasn't the end.
Right.
The Johnson family's relentless push for answers, the protests, the sheer weight of the forensic anomalies, it forced the doors open at the highest levels of law enforcement. They demanded federal intervention.
The Department of Justice.
Yes. In late 2013, federal authorities initiated a comprehensive review of the case. And Ryan, the scope of this review was staggering.
How vast was the operation? Because usually the feds don't get involved in local accidental deaths.
They don't. But this wasn't a cursory glance at the local police files. The federal review lasted nearly 2 full years.
2 years.
They deployed massive resources, they convened grand juries, they conducted hundreds of independent interviews with students, staff, teachers, and potential witnesses.
That's a huge undertaking.
It is. They subpoenaed emails and phone records. They examined thousands of pages of documents, forensic reports, and digital data. They brought the full weight and the investigative apparatus of the United States government down on Valdosta, Georgia.
2 years. Hundreds of interviews. Thousands of pages of subpoenas.
The expectation from the family and from the millions of people watching this case unfold nationally was that a review of this magnitude would finally cut through the local noise.
Right.
The hope was that the federal government would uncover the definitive truth of what happened in that gym.
But that isn't what happened.
No. At the end of that massive allocation of time and resources, the federal government released its conclusion. No charges were filed against anyone.
No charges.
The case was officially closed, and the final defining statement from the authorities was that there was no evidence of foul play.
No evidence of foul play.
Yeah.
Tessa, I have to push back hard on the specific language used in that conclusion. Because there is a vast, unbridgeable canyon between no evidence of foul play and proof of an accident.
There is. They are legally distinct concepts, and the distinction is crucial.
Let's explore that distinction. Because when a listener hears the Department of Justice step up to a microphone and say, no evidence of foul play, the natural human assumption is that they have definitively proven the shoe retrieval theory.
Yes.
The assumption is that the federal government proved it was a tragic accident. But that's not what those words actually mean in a court of law, is it?
No, Ryan, it isn't. And this requires a very methodical breakdown of how institutional momentum and federal law actually work.
Walk us through it.
When the Department of Justice steps into a local death investigation, they are not there to simply solve a mystery. They do not operate like a private detective trying to find out what happened.
Right.
They are there to determine if a prosecutable federal crime has occurred. In a case like this, they are often focusing on civil rights violations or the intentional deprivation of rights under color of law.
They are looking for a very specific, very high threshold of guilt.
Precisely. A federal civil rights prosecution is like trying to build a house of cards in a windstorm. To file federal charges, prosecutors need a flawless, unbroken chain of evidence that proves, beyond a reasonable doubt, that a specific individual or group of individuals intentionally caused Kendrick's death and did so with specific criminal intent.
Criminal intent.
Yes. They need motive, they need opportunity, and they need pure, untainted physical evidence linking a suspect directly to the crime scene.
And the crime scene was already severely compromised.
It was destroyed. The initial scene was cleared within hours. The mat was moved. The organs were missing, making it impossible to establish an undeniable mechanism of death.
Right.
The camera footage was broken and disjointed. So when the federal authorities say there is no evidence of foul play, they are speaking the language of prosecution. They are saying that after reviewing the fragmented, damaged, and missing evidence left over from the local investigation, they could not build a criminal case that would survive the scrutiny of a trial.
They couldn't prove a murder to a jury.
Right. But failing to find prosecutable foul play does not scientifically erase the anomalies.
It doesn't.
A federal legal conclusion does not heal the bruising on Kendrick's neck. It does not explain away the missing organs or the newspaper.
No.
It does not tell us whose blood was on the gym wall. It does not magically fill in the blank time codes on the surveillance tapes. It simply means the mechanism of justice stalled out due to a lack of actionable, pure data.
The legal system operates on the burden of proof.
It does.
It operates on what can be demonstrated in a courtroom. But physics operates on reality. The laws of gravity, fluid dynamics, and human anatomy don't care about a grand jury subpoena.
They really don't.
And when the legal system closes its doors, when the federal investigators pack up their boxes and leave town, the burden of the unknown doesn't just evaporate. It falls heavily, squarely, back onto the shoulders of the community and onto the family.
It leaves a gaping wound, Ryan, because the official paperwork may say the case is closed, but publicly and emotionally, this case has never ended.
No?
The aftermath of Kendrick's death and the subsequent investigations triggered a shockwave that extended far beyond Valdosta, Georgia.
It became a national flashpoint.
It drew intense national attention. There were massive protests. Civil rights organizations became deeply involved. It sparked a fierce, widespread public debate about the competence of local law enforcement, about the integrity of the medical examiner system, and about the deep inequalities in how death investigations are handled in America.
A decade later, the arguments haven't faded. The anger hasn't subsided.
They haven't, because the core questions that were asked on day one are the exact same questions being asked today.
Right.
The community is still demanding to know. Why were a 17-year-old boy's organs treated like trash? Why did the cameras fail exactly when they were needed most? Whose blood was inches away from where he died?
And how does a broad-shouldered athlete get wedged into a 14-inch opening of a freestanding mat without tipping it over?
The Johnson family has lived every single day of the last decade inside those questions. They lost a son with a bright future, a kid who just went to school one morning to go to class, and in return, they were handed a puzzle missing half its pieces.
Agonizing.
Kendrick Johnson's death remains one of the most debated, heavily scrutinized cases in modern American forensic history.
The case is officially closed. The legal avenues are exhausted. The paperwork is filed in a cabinet. But as we look at the autopsy files, as we look at the undeniable physical realities of that gym and the science of the scene, you are left with a haunting disconnect.
You are. A deep, unsettling lack of closure that no official document can fix.
How do we, as a society, reconcile the finality of a legal document with the permanence of physical impossibilities? When the official truth requires us to ignore the laws of physics and the evidence right in front of our eyes, where does a grieving family go for justice? We want to hear from you. If you have insights, questions, or theories, reach out. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.
And if you want to hear more episodes of The Dark Dive, consider following and subscribing. It helps us continue bringing these stories to light.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Dark Dive.